Hello everyone and welcome to Guildford County Schools presentation on how to revise. Over the years, one of the things that families have constantly said to us is, listen, when we've got a test coming up or when we've got an exam coming up and my child is asking questions about it, we sometimes feel like we don't know what to say to them at home in terms of supporting them in their revision. Well, over the last few years, we've done a huge amount of work in school, making sure that we are crystal clear with students about how they should go about revising. The purpose of this presentation is to make sure that those same messages are coming back to you so that we and you are saying exactly the same things, which will give your child a sense of confidence and mean that they can go on to do their very best in those exams. Let's talk a little bit then about the background to this presentation and what we're trying to achieve. Well, you're probably watching this presentation because we have sent you a parent mail, and on that parent mail we've probably said something along the lines of, your child has an exam coming up in maybe 2, 3, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 10 weeks. We tend to give more notice the older the child is. We don't want to ramp up the process of exams too much with our younger years. We've probably asked you to come and have a look at this presentation, and hopefully you get what you need out of it to help support your child at home. You could of course just stumbled across this presentation on YouTube, and if that applies to you as well, you're welcome to watch it at any time. We hope you find something useful in it. What's important for you to know is that in school we teach your children what they should be revising. So in each subject we are very clear with, these are the things you are going to be examined on, these are the topics, these are the types of questions, and of course we do huge amounts of work around how they should go about answering those questions. We also try and communicate this very clearly to families. So before any set of formal exams we will send home plans for the year group saying which subjects we'll be examining, which topics. What we are also very clear on though is how to revise. There has been lots said and written about revision over the years, about which are the best techniques to use. Most of that has been utter nonsense, and what we have learned over the years, both through researching the best educational literature but also through our experience, is that yes, there are lots of ways to revise, probably all of which have some benefits. There tends to just be one best way to revise. We think we're getting pretty close now to being able to certainly say this is absolutely the best way to revise, and therefore we are very clear with students that there is a particular method that they should use, which we're going to cover later in this presentation. Another key thing to think about before we start is that revision is not something that happens 2 weeks before a child's final exams in year 11 or in year 13. Getting ready for those exams is a 7-year journey at least. Of course, lots of children will go through SATs exams in infant school and in primary school, so you could argue that it's an even longer journey than these 7 years. But what we very much try to do at County is make sure that children get lots of opportunities to experience a formal exam setting. The stakes will feel much lower in year 7, but what we try and do is just gradually increase those stakes so that it's not an alien feeling for them when they walk into those exam halls in year 11 and in year 13. This works if you come and watch our year 11s or year 13s walk into an exam hall. There is an elite professionalism about the way they go about it. Well, the only reason they are able to behave in that way is because they have had lots of practice and guidance. Revisiting this regularly with them as we do, and hopefully you revisiting it with them at home, is one of the things that supports them on that journey. As I've said, we've looked at the best educational research, we've used the best of our experience. We've also, though, in recent years worked with a sports psychologist who has done a lot of work with high-performing sports individuals who are in school and has also worked with schools more generally. She has helped us to refine our thinking, refine our approach, and give us increased certainty around the messages that we are sending home. Last thing to say, of course, which I've alluded to already, is that revision works best when it is a whole family affair. And that doesn't necessarily mean that families will be involved minute by minute in the revision, but it does mean that the messages that children are being given are consistent, that they are supportive, that they are positive, and that families are there to support with some of the more practical aspects of revision that I will come to later. A few more notes now just about what to say around exams, what not to say, and some potentially quite challenging messages that might get you thinking and might get you reflecting on how you perhaps phrase things with your children. If this does push any buttons, apologies in advance. Hopefully being clear about these messages will be helpful in the long run. Absolutely positively, over the last few years, there has been an increased focus on mental health and well-being. And I don't think there are many people who would say that this hasn't been a good thing. For far too many years, we were shy about talking about our mental health and well-being, and the efforts over recent years to get people to be more open about their mental health and well-being and to take concrete steps to improve their mental health and well-being, that has been an overwhelmingly positive thing. However, as with anything, there is always, I guess, a slightly negative side to it. And what we have seen in school over the years is that because the debate about mental health is around in the media much more, is talked about much more, what that can cause some children to do is to overinterpret what are very normal feelings for any child or teenager who is growing up. Childhood and being a teenager, by its definition, is about making a very tricky transition from childhood into adulthood. It is a period of significant change biologically, hormonally, psychologically for any individual, and the vast majority of individuals go through a period that is difficult psychologically. They are learning things for the first time. They are learning how to have relationships where the other person might not be particularly straightforward, how to deal with conflict, how to have difficult conversations, how to choose friends, how to deal with rejection from one friendship group, how to build new ones. These are complicated things, and teenagers are doing them for the first time, and sometimes that leads to them being sad, and sometimes that leads to them crying, and sometimes that leads to them having sleepless nights. That is not a pleasant thing. However, it is a natural and necessary part of growing up. Because we talk so much about mental health, some children can think about those feelings that are quite temporary, and they can start to overanalyze them and start to think that they have significant mental health struggles, when in fact what they have is the experience of being a teenager. It is important as the adults in children's lives that we are very clear about this. Stress and anxiety are things that everybody feels. They come and go regularly. At the moment, I am feeling some low-level anxiety around speaking on this presentation. It feels quite high stakes. It feels like I have to get my messages very clear. It feels as if I make a mistake, I might upset parents that perhaps people will email in and complain about my messages. I'm aware that this is potentially going to a large audience of people, some of whom I know quite well. There are some anxieties and stresses in this process. However, those are normal. This is part of my job, and much like many of the people listening to this will have jobs where you have anxieties and stresses, they are a normal part of everybody's life. The very fact that you're watching this and probably have children will mean that you will face stress and anxiety, probably, like I do, every morning as I try and manage getting myself ready for my working day, as well as getting my children up and out of bed and to their schools. Stress and anxiety are normal parts of everybody's life. They come and go regularly, and we need to be very clear about this with children. If you are a family watching this who has a child who has a genuine mental health disorder, of course that is different. And we do work with families, and we do have children in school who have genuine disorders. That is incredibly difficult. The situations are incredibly complex, and how we support those children is not easy and something that takes a huge amount of work on the part, particularly of the child, massively for the family, of course, with schools supporting where we can. However, it's important that we keep this in context. Children who have genuine mental health disorders are very few and far between. And we need to be careful not to too quickly assume that a child has something that is chronic and that they will have to live with for a long period of time. In recent years, educational psychologists have started using this phrase, the snowplow parent. A few moments to just explain what that means. Psychologists characterise this parent as the parent who wants to clear away every bit of difficulty that their child might encounter. It is seen by some psychologists as the kind of scourge of modern parents and the mistake that many modern parents are making. We of course love our children, we want our children to live happy, contented, fulfilled lives, and it's very easy as parents to think that the way to do that is to make their path through life as smooth as possible. I am no doubt guilty of this at times. I'm sure anyone listening to this as a parent can think about times when perhaps they've made things too easy for their children. Their child has a difficulty in a friendship group, and the parent tries to get involved to solve it. Perhaps they have a difficulty with a teacher in school, and rather than coaching the child about how they might approach that teacher themselves and have that conversation, the parent immediately gets involved, and so on and so on. Very normal, natural and understandable why a parent would want to do that. However, we have to be careful that we don't remove from children what we would call desirable difficulty. As we've talked about, the teenage years are crucial. They are the time when children get to do many things for the first time, many of which are difficult and can cause them some anxiety and stress. However, it is only by going through that process that children learn the skills, learn how to self-regulate, and learn how to be proper functioning adults who can deal with these things far more effectively. If what they have on the sideline is someone who's always clearing away these opportunities to deal with difficulty, they will never learn those skills. And of course, those skills are hugely relevant to exams, they're hugely relevant to attendance, and they're hugely relevant to life in general. Very easy to think that exams are this awful thing that the education system inflicts on children. That is not true, and I will talk about that a bit in a second. It's very easy if your child has a bit of a sniffle or is feeling a bit low or is worried about coming to school because of something that's happening in their friendship group to say, don't worry, I'm working from home today, why don't you stay with me? Unfortunately, by making those kind of decisions, what you are doing is setting up your child to be an incompetent adult who won't necessarily have the experience of dealing with these things, and so will never really learn those skills in adulthood. So, exams, what are they like? Are they this horrible, archaic system of torture that we inflict on children? Well, they're not. We are lucky enough to watch children come in and out of exams all the time, and look, they might not be the kind of easy experience that children would pick as their first choice activity for any day. You know, give a child the option of, do you want to sit on the sofa and watch a film, or do you want to do an exam? They're probably going to pick sitting on the sofa watching a film. But exams are not unpleasant experiences. What you see at County when you see children doing their exams are children who are really professional. They line up in silence, they have to, because they are under exam conditions, and we teach them that from year 7 so that we don't have issues when they get to exams that are overseen by external bodies later on. They walk in with their uniforms looking perfect, with the right equipment. They know where they need to go and sit. They know exactly what to do at every step of the operation. And they know that because we teach them how to do it, and we coach them through some of the difficulties that exams can present to them. Children might not choose to do exams as their first activity. However, when they come out of exams, children are generally proud of themselves about the fact they've done something that's not straightforward, that has challenged them, but that they knew how to go about doing, and that builds confidence, self-esteem, and it means they are then better able to tackle more difficult experiences further down the line. Following on from this, it is therefore very important that the language we have around exams is positive. Whether you like it or not, and certainly your child probably won't like this idea, but children mirror their families. They tend to think what their families think, they tend to say what their families say, and they tend to behave in the ways that they've seen their family behave at home. They probably spend most of their childhood and teenage years kind of wishing they were nothing like their parents, and then of course they have that realization when they're older that it is their parent who they've probably turned into. Because of this, we have to recognize as parents that we have a dramatic impact on how our children view the world. Specifically with exams, the things we say about exams will be the things that children hear, that they therefore believe to be true, and will become part of their own characters. So if you say, "Oh, I always hated exams," if you say, "Oh, I got so stressed in exams," then what will happen is your child will learn that hating exams is a normal thing to do, and that being stressed about exams is a normal thing to do, and that is who they will become. If you tell them that exams are pointless, if you tell them that the real world isn't like exams, that will be an attitude they adopt, and their motivation for them will be lower. This point, by the way, is also just utterly wrong. Exams are one of the best opportunities that children have to experience the idea that sometimes in life there are higher stress and higher anxiety moments where we have to perform. Those of you listening to this presentation will all have times in your lives that are different in that they feel more pressured because you have to get something right. Now, depending on your job, depending on the kind of life you lead, those things might come along every few months. In some professions, you are having these high stakes encounters possibly several times a day. Those types of encounters take preparation, they take thinking in advance, they take self-regulation, been able to manage yourself and get yourself ready for what it is you have to do and where you have to perform. Exams are one of the opportunities we give children. They are one of these desirable difficulties that enable them to experience that process. And if all we tell children is, oh, exams are pointless, the real world's not like that, well, not only is that untrue, because at times the real world is like that, but it's also not giving them that opportunity to learn those very important skills. Just keeping in mind that whatever you say, those will be the thoughts and the behaviours that your child plays out. There are some alternatives. Now, you might be reading these and thinking they are so dreadfully positive, and you can't imagine yourself saying them. These might not be your words, and they might not be the way that you would choose to phrase things. But what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that there are some really positive ways we can talk about exams. Fantastic, they're a chance to show off all your hard work. We've been talking about this. What a great opportunity to learn how to perform on important occasions. You could perhaps get technical. We're going to talk about long-term memory in a minute, and maybe you could consolidate that idea with your child at home. Brilliant. You know, what a way to motivate yourself to get things into your long-term memory. You feel nervous? Of course you do. That's your body's way of getting you ready to perform. And also being clear that with most exams, the exception here perhaps being the end of Year 11 GCSE exams and Year 13 A-level exams, is that the vast majority of exams are not kind of terminal. They don't come at the end of anything. And in the vast majority of them, what you come out with, once you've got the feedback from your teachers, is an understanding of, yay, I can do this really, really well. This thing I'm okay at, but I can improve a bit. This bit I just didn't know, and that's the thing I really need to focus on next. We're in the business in schools of education, of learning, and that begins by knowing what it is you're not so good at and where you need to improve. Well, exams provide that opportunity. These are the kinds of really positive things you can say about exams that will help your child as they go through their schooling. Let's now go on and be a little bit more technical and talk about revising, the theory behind it, and also very practically how you might go about it. The most important thing to understand when it comes to revision is how our memories work. Exams are tests of our memory. Therefore, we have to understand how our memory works in order to make sure that we are preparing children properly to be able to perform in exams. We're going to talk about two different types of memory, what is termed working memory and what is termed long-term memory. A few caveats before we start. I am not a psychologist, I am not a neurologist. This is based on the reading I have done in educational research, the advice of a sports psychologist. Of course, brains don't work in this super simple way that is pictured in front of you. It is far more complicated than that, but this provides us a useful way of understanding how memory works. Let's start off by thinking about working memory. Working memory is the thing that we are using all the time to deal with the tasks that are in front of us. If you are driving somewhere, it is your working memory that is at play. Your working memory is figuring out is thinking about how to drive. It is also perhaps following the sat nav. It is looking for things that are coming up that are landmarks that can match to the sat nav to tell you which direction to go in. The working memory are all the things that you have to hold in your brain at one time in order to do things. If we think about a child in a classroom, they are using their working memory in lessons. Their working memory is helping them listen to the teacher. It is helping them read what is on the board or on the slide. It is also the bit which is thinking, I need to take notes on this, I need to write this down, I need to draw this diagram. It is also the part of their brain which is getting perhaps distracted if they are getting notifications coming through on their phone, which they still have on in their pocket, which is one of the reasons, by the way, we are so anti-phones and say please don't get your child a phone, but we'll come back to that later. And they are also perhaps distracted by a child next to them who's saying something that's unhelpful, which is why we are very strict in school about paying attention and making sure that we're not distracting others. The reason we think so carefully about these things is that our working memory is limited. There are only so many things that our working memory can focus on at any point. Now, depending what those things are, and depending which bit of research you read, that might be 3 things, 5 things, 7 things. If that part of your brain starts getting overloaded, if there are too many things that you have to concentrate on at the same time, then your working memory will get overloaded and you'll stop being able to do any of them effectively. Anyone who's played those games where you have to do kind of multiple things at the same time, you will know that there is a limit to how much you are able to concentrate on at one moment. That's your working memory. That's what we use most of the time, and that's what children are using in the classroom. There is also, though, a different part of our memory which we would refer to as our long-term memory. Now, getting stuff into our long-term memory can be quite difficult, and we'll talk about that in more detail shortly. If I told you a phone number, you might be able to hold it in your working memory for long enough for you to be able to dial that number on your phone. However, if I asked you what that number was in 3 weeks' time, there is very little chance that you would be able to remember it. And that is because that phone number existed only in your working memory and did not transfer into your long-term memory. Now, what we know from the educational research is that our long-term memories are kind of almost limitless, really. It seems that we are yet to reach the limits of what a human can store in their long-term memory, provided they are able to get it in there in the first place. Once it's in there, it's generally pretty secure over time, and then of course we can draw on that long-term memory when we need it. One of the places that children will need to be able to draw on their long-term memory is in exams, where of course they will need to know all kinds of things and draw them from their long-term memory to be able to use them in their answers. Let's start to think about how working memory and long-term memory link up when it comes to a child who is trying to learn something in a subject. What I'm going to talk about here is work that is very well known in psychological circles. It's been in existence for about 140, 150 years since a German psychologist known as Ebbinghaus first started to do experiments on himself about how his memory worked. What I'm going to show you is indicative. It differs slightly in different studies. It differs by individual. And I'm only showing it to you as an illustration of how memory works. It will of course be different in different circumstances. But what Ebbinghaus and dozens of researchers since have shown is that if we learn something in class, for the first time, if asked to recall that information, in that moment our recall is probably going to be quite high. Might be 70, 80, 90, depending on what the information is. It might even be 100%. So if you're being taught something for the first time by a good teacher who is really clear in their explanations, and that teacher says to you, do you understand that? Can you tell me what I've just told you? Our recall of that new information is probably going to be quite high. But what we know is that very, very quickly, our ability to recall that information will diminish. The reason for that, of course, is that information is being held in our working memory. And our working memory, as we know, is limited. Our working memory very quickly becomes overloaded. And as soon as new information starts coming in, what our working memory does is it has to get rid of that information that it was being told a little while ago. Now, this is a problem for schools and for teachers and for students because, of course, they are getting bombarded with new information on a minute-by-minute basis. What you see happen, therefore, is if you ask a child to recall information that they've been told recently, their recall will be very high. 10 minutes later, it will be less. A day later, it will be massively less. And in some cases, again, depending on what you're looking at, it might be that even just one day later, if they have that same lesson the next day, they might only recall something like 20% of that original information. A week later, even less. A month later, even less. And very quickly, they will have nothing except a kind of broad recollection that perhaps they studied something about it. And that's because the information was held in their working memory. What Ebbinghaus theorized and other researchers showed is that if you revisit that information now, something begins to happen. Yes, you begin to forget things. These, by the way, were called Ebbinghaus's forgetting curves. Yes, you begin to forget things, but the rate at which you forget them decreases. And what he and others theorized and found is that by repeating information, working with information again and again, you very quickly get to a point where your recall can be very, very high. Now, a practical example of this from our lives, if we go back to the example of driving somewhere, if we are driving somewhere new for the first time and we are using our sat-nav, if we were asked at the end of that journey to recall the directions we took to get to a destination, our recall might be pretty high. But if we were asked in a month's time, how did you get from here to here, and you'd only done it once and you'd relied on sat-nav, well, your recall perhaps wouldn't be that high at all. If we did the journey a second time though, and then a third time and then a fourth time, very quickly, first of all, you stop relying on sat-nav because you don't need it anymore. And secondly, you'd be able to easily tell someone else the directions to get somewhere. What is happening there is the process of moving knowledge, information from your working memory into your long-term memory. And that's how it works for children too. When it comes to revision then, this is really helpful. When children are revising for exams, they are basically doing two things. They are first of all thinking about what they need to know. In other words, what knowledge, what facts, what information do they need to have readily available? That knowledge, of course, has to be in their long-term memory, because if it's not in their long-term memory, it is unlikely to be available to them when they need it, because, of course, their working memory is limited in terms of what it can remember. The second thing that they need to know is how they are able to use that knowledge. In most subjects there is some kind of question, and children have to be able to think about the knowledge they know, what the internal angles of a regular pentagon are, for example. They have to pull that knowledge from their long-term memory, and they generally then have to apply it to some kind of question. When they are applying it, they are of course using their working memory to go through those processes, which is also why it's so crucial that they're not trying to rely on their working memory to remember those facts. They just need to know them. They need to just exist in their long-term memory, and that means they can do much better at the applying bit. We spend a huge amount of time in school focusing on number 2. How do you do questions? How do you answer them? What's the formula for this? What's the formula for that? How do you approach this extract? Those kind of skill things are what we spend most of our time in lessons doing. Now, of course, we also teach lots of new facts, lots of new knowledge, but in terms of transferring that knowledge to long-term memory, this is something that it is within the student's responsibility to make sure that they are doing the things necessary to put that into their long-term memory. We do not have sufficient time in school to go over repeatedly information that they need to know and get it into their long-term memories. If we did that, we would barely get through 10% of any course that the government asks us to teach, which is why when we set homework and when we get children revising for exams, our focus for them is on getting that knowledge into their long-term memory. That therefore underpins what we say to children about how to revise. Over the years, as I said right at the start of this presentation, there has been lots written and said about revision. People will advise to make mind maps, to write notes, to read over notes, to highlight, to do all kinds of things as a process of revision. Now, probably any type of revision that a child does has some kind of benefit. However, study after study have shown that many ways of revising are largely ineffective. Highlighting, summarising notes in bullet points, doing mind maps, they perhaps have some benefit. They're not useless, however they are largely ineffective as ways of revising. Study after study has demonstrated that there are many ways to revise, but there is really only one best way. And what we try to teach children and would ask you to support at home is what that best way is. Now, coming out of the research very, very strongly is that there are 2 things that children need to do if they are to move things into their long-term memory. The first thing is to use the process of self-testing. Self-testing is very effective because it is generally quite low stress, and it means that children learn how to draw things from their long-term memory, and that of course is what they have to do in their exams, and it also means that they identify where there are gaps in their knowledge. The second thing that they need to do, which is an effective revision technique, is they need to practice putting that information into their long-term memory, but they need to space out or distribute that practice. It is no good doing 3 hours of revision the night before an exam, hoping that that will mean you can perform at your best. It might improve your performance, you might put some things into your working memory, but you are not going to put things into your long-term memory, and therefore you won't reach your potential in the exam. In order to do that, you have to practice over time with gaps in between those practices to make sure that information is going into your long-term memory. Let's look at how you might take these 2 principles, self-testing and spaced or distributed practice, and actually use it. And let's look at it in 3 stages. Now, this is what we say to children. We revisit this with children recently, and we teach them about these 3 stages. Stage number 1 is the sort of preparation organisation stage. Now, this is the stage that some children can get a little bit overexcited about and spend all their time doing this and no time actually doing perhaps the slightly duller bit, which is putting things into their long-term memory. This is the organisation stage. Have they got things like topic lists? In other words, do they know what it is they have to revise? All subjects at County provide topic lists. We send these home in our curriculum plans. These are available. If there are any gaps that children feel they have, they can go and ask teachers. They can get these topic lists. Have they got a revision timetable? Do they know when they are going to do which bits of revision? And we'll come back to the best way of doing that later. Do they have the resources they need? Perhaps that's revision guides, perhaps that's their notes that they've taken in class, perhaps that's resources that they have on Teams or other online platforms. Do they have some flashcards ready to go, which we'll go back to in a second. Part of that organisation might be just getting a sense of how they feel about different topics. Now, very randomly here, we've taken an example from science in year 8, and here are some of the different topics that children might be covering. And to begin with, we ask children to RAG the topics they have to revise. RAG stands for red, amber, green, and it's about children starting to think, well, look, this is a subject I barely know what the words mean for this topic. That would be a red. Amber is, yeah, I kind of generally got an idea of this, but if I was tested on it, I wouldn't really know any of the detail. Green are the ones where I'm all over this. I could go in an exam tomorrow and I'd get all the questions right. Beginning by just thinking about which of the topics that a child is more confident in, less confident in, that allows them to prioritise where they should revise first. Now here, folks, is a crucial point. Over the years, we have had thousands of discussions with children in the run-up to their exams, and over again, what you find is when you talk to them about where they are doing well, which subjects they're doing well in, and which subjects they're not doing so well in, when you then say to them, okay, where are you doing the most revision? 90% of the time what that child will tell you is, oh, I'm doing revision in the subjects that I'm doing well in. The reason for that is because as human beings, we like feeling competent, clever, we like a sense of success, and so it is very natural therefore that children are drawn to revising those subjects that they enjoy and that they do well at, because that makes them feel better about themselves. Unfortunately, where they need to spend their time is on those subjects where perhaps they don't have such positive feelings. This process of ragging helps children to understand that, and that's something that you can really support at home. No one is saying that revision is an activity that children would choose to do, particularly on a subject perhaps that they don't feel particularly good at. But mastering difficult things, overcoming obstacles, doing things that are difficult now for a reward later on, that's an important life lesson. So really get your children focusing on those red and amber topics. The second stage is about self-testing. Now, self-testing has two benefits. First of all, the process of testing gives your brain the opportunity to practice recalling stuff from your long-term memory, and we know from research that that practice itself can strengthen some of the relationships in your brain and mean you get more efficient at doing that. But also, crucially, of course, it's a brilliant way of identifying what you don't know. And there is a way we teach children to self-test. First thing to do is have a piece of paper and divide it up as you can see on the screen. So we've got a vertical line which is splitting the paper into a kind of 1/3 and 2/3, and then we've got a box at the bottom, and divide a piece of paper up like this. Don't take too long over it. Again, one of the mistakes that some children make is they think this is an art project and they have to, do things in 14 different colours and make it all beautiful and lovely and all the rest of it. Understandable why they want to do that, but not a particularly efficient use of time. Topic title goes at the top. Maybe that's, the First World War if they are doing history. What you write down that left-hand side are the key questions. If we take the topic of the First World War, I don't know, that might be, what was the situation before the war? What were the main causes of the war? What were the key points in the war? How did the war end? What were the things that resulted from the war's end? Maybe those are the 5 kind of key questions that go down the left-hand side. What will go on the right-hand side are all the things that a child can remember about those key questions. And then what goes at the bottom is a summary. The important messages, the things perhaps that they keep forgetting, or they perhaps keep phrasing wrong, or they keep using the wrong word for. What are the big things that they have to remember that are going to go there? So let's work through an example of this. Well, if we take science as an example now, the first thing we need to do is come up with the key questions. Now, the great thing here is that actually revision guides, which are available generally pretty cheaply, very cheaply if you go on marketplaces like Amazon and get second-hand copies of these books. They're often available for pennies. Those, if you look in a particular topic, in this case enzymes and digestion, the headings generally work as key questions, so those can just be drawn across as key questions. The important thing is, of course, that when children are doing this, they try to make sure they don't read the information underneath. So there are those key questions. Where does respiration occur in cells, etc., down the left-hand side. Now, what are their key thoughts around this? In other words, what are all the things that they can remember about these key questions? This is the point where children should just write everything that they can possibly draw from their long-term memory about these key questions. Some of them they might have a lot, some of them they might have next to nothing. Let's look at an example of what that might look like. This is from a student revising PRE. Down the left hand side there are some key questions around creation. What you will then notice is that in black on the right hand side they've written down everything that they can remember. The bits in red though are the really important bits. Having written down in black everything they can remember, what they then do is open their notes, perhaps go on the PowerPoint from the lesson, open their revision guide, and they add in anything that they forgot. And those are the things you can see in red here. This student, decent start, they could remember some things about creation, but you can see in red all of the things that they couldn't remember. At the bottom of this bit of paper is where they then start summarising the key bits of information that they need to remember. Now, once they've done this, they've got a really good resource because in front of them they can see what they already can remember and what they can't remember. What they then need to do is make sure that this information that they can't remember is something that they begin the process of putting into their long-term memory. Now, the best way for them to do this is to use spaced or distributed practice, and the way that we advise students to do this is by using flashcards. They take all that information that they didn't know and they put that information onto flashcards. A note about flashcards. The key thing with flashcards, first of all, is that the information that is on there is accurate. We do unfortunately come across occasions where, because children didn't take care when they were creating their flashcards, what they end up doing is remembering the wrong information. So accuracy is the most important thing, making sure that what's on a flashcard is actually correct. The second thing is that flashcards should not be too overcomplicated. If you look at the example at the bottom here, we have a key term, photosynthesis, and then we have a very clear definition on the back of that flashcard. Up the top right, we have a measurement of weight, and then on the back, a formula, an explanation of that formula about how that is calculated. On the left, we have much more complicated flashcards. Now, this can work for some students, but it is worth, where possible, students just trying to think about how they keep their flashcards as simple as possible. Flashcards that are too complicated become too much like revision notes. They're not very usable for self-testing. Last thing to think about is they should be neat. Sometimes it's sort of the other end of the spectrum. You know, you have some students who create these wonderful bits of artwork which are just too much and a waste of time. Sometimes you also get children who create things that are just really, really scruffy, which then leads to problems with them not being able to read what they're putting on there in the first place. Now, there are online programs you can use to create flashcards. That's absolutely fine. There are also some online programs where it's all done virtually. Programs like Anki and Quizlet and various other platforms have the ability to do that. The one thing that I would say is that the majority of students find that there is something better about having physical flashcards. Now, I don't know whether that's just familiarity or not, but certainly that would be my experience, and certainly my experience of some of the children I've worked one-to-one with. Physical flashcards have a real value. That's a choice, though, for your child and for you. And if you want to investigate those online systems because it fits with your lives, then that's something that you can do. Once you have these flashcards of this information that is not yet in your long-term memory, you then have to have a system of spaced or distributed practice to get it into your long-term memory. Now, we know from research and experience that the best way of getting that information into your long-term memory is to use a system like the Leitner system. The Leitner system is a system of repetition to make sure that this information is constantly repeated in a child's mind so that it eventually goes into their long-term memory. Now, the way to run the Leitner system is as follows. You need 3 boxes. Now, those boxes do not need to be posh. They do not need to be made of a fine wood. They do not need carvings on them. If that's what you want to have, then that is fine. But typically what students will do is they'll get 3 shoe boxes. The run up to big exams is often a time when shoe boxes in Guildford are in short supply. 3 shoe boxes is fine. In box 1, you place every single flashcard. Now, the reason you put every flashcard in box 1 is because at that point, the student does not know the information on those flashcards. They could not recall it, and therefore it's not yet in their long-term memory. What they then do is they self-test. And with box 1, they need to do that quite regularly, perhaps every 3 or 4 days, perhaps once a week, but they need to be regularly testing themselves on the flashcards that are in box 1. As they are testing themselves, if they get a flashcard right, if they can recall perfectly the information on that flashcard, well, then that flashcard goes into box 2. Box 2, they test less frequently. Maybe every 8 or 9 days, maybe every fortnight, something like that. Every fortnight, they go through box 2 and they test themselves on the flashcards that are in there. If they get the information on that flashcard wrong, or they can't recall it all, no problem. It goes back into box 1 and they start testing themselves on it more regularly. If, though, they still can recall that information, even though they're only revisiting it once a fortnight, then it goes into box 3. And box 3 might be a box that you test every 3 weeks, every 4 weeks. Again, if a flashcard gets into box 3, it probably means a student knows that information pretty well. But if they test themselves on it 3 weeks or a month later and they get it wrong, it goes all the way back to box 1. This process works, and it is remarkable how quickly any student can take sometimes huge amounts of information and transfer it solidly into box 3, and it stays in box 3, and therefore that information remains in their long-term memory. It really is quite remarkable. Now, students like this system because it is very concrete, it's very certain. They can visibly see the process of things going into their long-term memory. And when they see that, it builds their confidence, reduces their stress and anxiety around exams, boosts their self-esteem, and means they are able to perform better. We come now to the last few messages around revision. A note about phones and music, and then we will talk about how to actually schedule revision sessions, which is something that there's again a lot of information out there about. Just very quickly, there is a huge amount of evidence now on mobile phones and distractions, electronic devices and all the rest of it. Some of the research is remarkable. A phone can be off but in the same room as a student, and even then it can have a dramatic impact on how effective they are at studying. It seems that in the modern world, even if our phone is often in the same room as us, a part of our working memory is still thinking about that phone. If part of our working memory is occupied with that, what we are then able to less do well is to focus on the revision. Phones do not play a positive role in revision. They need to be off, they need to be away. If a child is going to do some revision, they need to give it to one of their family members to sort of make it disappear for the period of time when they are revising. Our view in school, of course, is that phones are generally not helpful to children and they don't need them, certainly not until they're much, much older. However, if you choose to give your child a phone, certainly around revision, please make sure they are nowhere near them. We get asked a lot about music and the role that music can play in the process of revision. We'll be honest here, the research is very mixed. There is some research that says that in certain situations having music on that doesn't have any lyrics doesn't have a negative effect on working memory. There are some studies which suggest it might even enhance it in some regards. What we would say though is that, of course, what we're trying to do here is get children ready to perform in a very particular environment, and that's the silent exam hall environment. Therefore, you need to think very carefully about when you might allow music and when you wouldn't. When you're doing perhaps some of the more administrative tasks around revision, like creating flashcards, where you have to concentrate, but perhaps you don't have to concentrate at your absolute best, perhaps some classical music in the background is not harmful to that process. However, when you're going through the process of trying to recall information on flashcards, or perhaps doing a timed answer for a subject, having music on, we would suggest, is not a good thing. That's not what's going to happen in the exam, so you're not practicing the skills that you need to be practicing for the exam. The last big topic is, of course, how do you schedule your revision? How do you go about doing that? Few things to say here. Firstly, revision sessions need to be proportionate. What is in front of you now is a sample timetable that was used by a GCSE student. This would, I would suggest, not be appropriate for a Year 7 student. It's very much about kind of gradually increasing the commitment that a child might make to their revision over the year, so that when they get to Year 11, it's something that they can take in their stride. The second thing to say about scheduling revision is that keeping other activities as priorities is very important. We'll go through this revision timetable in a minute, but Friday is quite a light day, and that's because, let's say this student has, I don't know, basketball club on a Friday evening. Saturday is an entire day off when the student is going to go round for a family event at their grandparents', let's say. There is no reason why revision should overtake life, and there is no reason why, within reason, a child can't keep doing all the other things they would normally do to keep a well-balanced, healthy mindset. Other things to say about revision. Generally, short and sharp, intensive sessions are far better than anything too long. We recommend around 30 minutes for a single session, and that has generally been shown as being the sweet spot in terms of the time that a child should spend. What we often come across, we've had lots of conversations with students and families over the years where a student will say, I'm really stressed, I'm working for hours and hours and hours, I'm feeling burnout, I can't possibly go on. What you generally find in that situation is when you talk to the student about the work they are doing, those 4 or 5 hours of revision are very unfocused. Often it'll be a child sort of sitting on their bed, surrounded by notes, mindlessly reading a few things, occasionally, getting up to change the music. They're not really revising in a fully focused, effective way. It therefore, though, is, as well as not being effective, it's incredibly tiring, because to kind of half do something for 4 or 5 hours is very tiring. And yes, they are going to feel exhausted and burned out if they do that. Doing that, though, is not effective revision. 30 minutes where you have an outcome, something that you will achieve in that 30 minutes, is the way to revise. Those 30 minutes should be intense. They should be like an exam. There should be no distractions, and they should, when they press go on the timer, that should be a period of time when they are hyper focused. The great thing is, though, after that 30 minutes is up, they should stop and they should do something else. We know that is best for their revision, and of course it is also best for making sure they maintain a healthy attitude and a healthy balance around their revision. So a child who sits down and says, in this 30 minutes, I'm going to go through my flashcards for science, that's going to be 15 minutes, and then I am going to do 2 4-mark questions for PRE. That is my 30-minute session. Go and intensively do those things. That is how to run a revision session. That means, of course, that the preparation has to be done in advance. Don't let your child tell you that them faffing about putting pretty colours on a flashcard for 30 minutes is a revision session. That isn't a revision session. That's preparation. That needs to be done perhaps in a more relaxed way at another time. One of the things we advise around revision sessions is that children plan their week. You'll notice if you go to Sunday on here that one of the sessions is a half-hour session where you plan the week ahead. Planning is really important. Firstly, as we've already said, because the first thing that should go on that plan are any social activities, clubs that you go to. They need to take priority, because that is what's going to provide the balance to any of the normal stresses and anxiety a child will feel around exams. What we would then encourage children to do is to think about gold, silver and bronze nights. A bronze night would be where they spent 2 sessions of 30 minutes revising. On Friday, this child goes off to some social event. They've had a long week at school. They don't want to do too much. They just decide they're going to do 2 sessions of 30 minutes. We would recommend they have 1 or perhaps 2 silver nights. This is where they do 3 sessions. We would then also recommend they have 3 what we call gold nights, plus this super gold day, which we'll come to in a second. But a gold night is 4 lots of 30-minute revision sessions. Weekends, a day off is really important, but also weekends. The reality for children is that's when they can get a lot of work done, and we would generally recommend that one of those weekend days, where possible, was where they perhaps did this super gold night or this gold plus night, which is about doing perhaps 4 or 5 sessions, but also picking up anything they didn't get finished in the week that's gone. And also, as I said, making sure they're planning for the upcoming week. Now, a child who is doing this for a period of weeks before an exam, let's say in year 11, they are going to do well. And they are going to do well because they are doing a lot of work, but they are doing that work in the most effective way. And crucially, they are also doing it in a way that won't lead to them feeling fatigued and stressed. The opposite of that, actually. They'll be seeing so much benefit from their revision, and they'll feel so much in control of it, that this will hopefully be, although a difficult process for them, a positive process. So we come lastly to just a summary of the messages that hopefully you've heard throughout this presentation. Firstly, please be positive. Not all children in the world get an education. Trying to pretend that a child sitting an exam is some form of archaic torture is not helpful. It's not. It's a massive privilege. There are children around the world who would bite the hands off the children who come to our school to be able to have the same experience that they do. If they learn, if they remember things, if they go through the experience of how to perform in an exam, that opens up the world for them. It gives them lots and lots of opportunities, and that is something that is worth celebrating and encouraging them to go after. And even if the academic world isn't their thing, that's fine. We don't care about that. But the process of getting ready for exams is one of those great experiences in life, because it prepares you to do difficult things. It teaches you the process of getting ready for difficult things and performing well at them. Second thing that I hope you've heard loudly and clearly is that most revision methods don't work, or at least they're not the best way of revising. What works is self-testing and spaced or distributed practice. And the reason those two things work is because they help get things into a child's long-term memory, and that has to be the focus. The third message that I hope comes out here is that if a child is organised, if a child is focused, and if they work hard, and those are 3 things that families can support them with: to be organised, to be focused, and to work hard, that does not increase stress and anxiety, it reduces it. We do sometimes work with children who feel stressed and anxious about exams. In nearly every case, that's because they're either not working hard enough, it's because they're not working in the right way. The purpose of this presentation and sharing it with you is to make sure that we have our messages crystal clear at school and at home, and make sure that we're avoiding situations where children are feeling overly stressed and anxious. And we're avoiding them by making sure they are organised, that they are focused, and that they are working hard and in the right way. That's the end of this presentation. Thank you so much for your time in listening to it. We hope you found it useful. If you do have any questions, getting in touch with tutors if it's a general question. If it's a question specific to a subject, please do get in touch with subject teachers. We are here to help and support you as well as your child, and we look forward to watching them flourish in the exams and take a huge amount out of the experience. Thank you very much.